Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. Absalom had stolen the kingdom from his father and deemed himself king. But God had anointed David as the true king of Israel. Now the conflict was going to come to a final and costly conclusion. Only one man would be standing when the battle was over. And it doesn't take a betting man to guess that David would be the one sitting on the throne when the day was done. But as we'll see in 2 Samuel 18, verses 1 through 18, his return to the throne would not be without cost. His son would die, along with 20,000 other Israelites, innocent men who would give their lives in a senseless and needless civil war that could be linked all the way back to David's indiscretion with Bathsheba. And the very fact that his son had been around to lead a coup against him was David's fault. He had brought all of this on himself. But God, ever faithful, had stepped in and cleaned up David's mess, restoring him to the throne, but not without the great loss of life. Like a modern-day soap opera, there are so many plots and subplots going on in this passage that it's difficult to know exactly what the main point may be. You have the battle between the forces of David and those of Absalom. There's Joab mortally wounding Absalom, providing what would appear to be a well-justified judgment for his rebellion. But what Joab did was against the direct orders of David, which brings up another intriguing subplot. Why was David, yet again, unwilling to enact justice against a rebellious son? He had failed to punish Amnon for his rape of Tamar. He had also failed to enact judgment on Absalom for his murder of Amnon, which had eventually led to Absalom's loss of respect for David and his overthrow of his kingdom. And finally, we see the interesting side note that tells of Absalom having erected a monument to himself. That part shouldn't surprise us, because we've seen ample evidence of Absalom's pride. But what's significant is the statement, "I have no son to carry on my name." 2 Samuel 18, verse 18. How could that be? According to 2 Samuel 14, verse 27, Absalom had 3 sons and a daughter. What would possess him to say that he had no son to carry on his name? Perhaps his sons had refused to follow in their father's footsteps. There's the possibility that they had all died. Or it could be that Absalom had erected the monument before his sons had been born. But whatever the case, Absalom left a lasting memorial to himself by erecting a monument that bore his own name. Nothing ever seems to be tidy and neat when it comes to the life of David. This section is no different than any of the others we've read. There are so many complications and conflicts going on, it can be difficult to keep up. The battle between David's forces and those of Absalom, as significant as it was, is nothing compared to all the many conflicts taking place behind the scenes. David had specifically commanded that Absalom be spared, yet Joab, the commander of his army, and the one who had convinced David to allow Absalom to return to Jerusalem in the first place, would disobey those orders. Easily overlooked in all of this is the fact that more than 20,000 Israelites lost their lives that day. This had been a civil war, an internecine conflict between brothers. David lost a son, but as a result of his failure to deal with Absalom's original sin against Amnon, David had caused many Israelites to lose their fathers, sons, and brothers. There would be 20,000 other graves dug that day. There would be countless mothers, fathers, wives, brothers, and sisters mourning the loss of someone they loved. And all of this can be traced back to David's sin with Bathsheba. Absalom would be the 3rd son David would lose as a result of his moral indiscretion. In Psalm 63, written while he was hiding in the wilderness, David penned the following words, "But those plotting to destroy me will come to ruin. They will go down into the depths of the earth. They will die by the sword and become the food of jackals. But the king will rejoice in God. All who swear to tell the truth will praise him, while liars will be silenced." Psalm 63, verses 9 through 11. David believed in the vengeance of God, but it seems he had a hard time seeing it applied to one of his own. David's command that the life of Absalom be spared does not reflect well on David's leadership. It speaks of his regret and recognition that all of this was his own fault. He is reticent to punish Absalom, but his unwillingness to deal with the rebellion of Absalom would have set a dangerous precedent. He needed to reestablish his authority and nip this thing in the bud. But it took Joab, disobeying a direct order of the king, to do what needed to be done. Joab was forced to go against the king's wishes and risk his retribution, but he did the right thing. The rebellion had been ended and its leader eliminated. David's reign over Israel had been restored. And it's important to note that David played no part in any of it. On the advice of Joab, David remained behind, safe and sound and out of danger. Perhaps Joab had known that, had David gone into battle, he would have spared the life of Absalom. So he had recommended that David stay behind, and David had readily agreed. With all that happens in this passage, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that God was in control. The events recorded in these verses are an expression of God's divine will concerning Absalom and David. From God's perspective, Absalom was a usurper to the throne. He had no right to claim the kingship of Israel. David was still the Lord's anointed. All of this was part of God's plan to deal with Absalom's sin against Amnon. David may have been willing to overlook and forget what Absalom had done, but God was not. The rebellion of Absalom should have been a wake-up call to David, telling him just how dangerous it can be to turn a blind eye toward sin. Absalom's rebellion, while apparently successful, was destined to be short-lived because it did not have God's backing. It was simply a means by which God was going to repay Absalom while teaching David yet another vital lesson in justice. As the story unfolds, we will see David weep over the loss of Absalom, but we will not see him shed a single tear for the unnecessary loss of life that came as a result of Absalom's rebellion. There will be no mention of the 10 concubines violated by Absalom on the palace rooftop. David would return to power, but over a fractured and divided nation, and his continual mourning over the loss of his son would send a confusing message to those who had fought for him and helped restore his kingdom to him. Absalom was dead, but the difficulties were far from over. David had his work cut out for him, and it was going to take Joab once again to help David do the right thing. God would use this faithful friend to speak truth into David's life, convicting him and forcing him to do what God would have him do.